Welcome to Royal Haunts and the Lancastrians. The House of Lancaster reigned for a relatively short period, from 1399 to 1471. Henry IV was a strong contender to the throne after Richard II, as he had no children, but there was children from more senior members. Edward III's second son, Lionel of Antwerp, had one child, a daughter, Philippa, this line of the family being known as Yorkists. Henry also took the crown in battle, not that there was much to fight about, as Richard had become so unpopular to have enough enemies to see his downfall, and Henry couldn't have timed his arrival any better. While Richard was in Ireland, Henry landed in Yorkshire with an army of 300 men, gathering support as he made his way to London. Those that could have opposed him turned a blind eye, as Henry claimed his only demand was to receive the inheritance made forfeit to the crown. With bad weather holding back his return, by the time Richard landed it was too late, and seeing his support had dwindled, he surrendered. Although Edmund Mortimer was next in line to the throne, with Richard having named him successor, Henry had a strong following at the side of the 7-year-old boy. Parliament deposed Richard and declared Henry the new king. It may have been easy for Henry to usurp the crown, but it was then a matter of keeping it. For most of his reign there was plots to depose him, and as for Richard, he could well have rallied support and made a comeback, and so was far too dangerous to set free or keep alive. Being imprisoned at Pontefract Castle in West Yorkshire, he died 5 months later, either by being starved to death or the more popular theory that men rushed in with swords and axes. Oddly enough, to say Richard's death was a case of murder, he doesn't seem to haunt the castle. Instead, the most prominent presence is that of a monk, seen more often during the winter months. Staff have reported many instances of unexplainable events in the form of knocking to glimpsing a dark shadow. Henry IV was a widower with 6 children when he became king, 4 being sons. Henry married for a second time to a widow, Joan or Joanna of Navarre. She had 4 children from a prior marriage, but none with Henry. When Henry IV died in 1413, his eldest son became King Henry V. It was a few short years later that his stepmother was accused of using witchcraft in a bid to kill the king. Joan was imprisoned at Pevensey Castle, where she spent 3 years, only being reprieved by Henry on his deathbed, possibly feeling remorse. She is now said to haunt the ruins of the castle, along with several others. Being close to the battle site at Hastings, there have been reported sounds of men fighting and groans of those who died in that savage battle. Pevensey was originally a Roman fort, and it comes with its own ghostly Roman soldier. Henry V married Catherine of Valois, whose secret marriage to Owen Tudor, if there was one at all, would lead her grandson to usurp the English throne, forming the Tudor dynasty. She had one son with Henry, who was 8 months old when his father died. While away on one of many campaigns throughout his life, Henry went down with dysentery, the blight of many a soldier, and as was often the case, fatal. Henry's death left a young widow and the country with an infant king, and as had happened 3 times during Plantagenet rule, the reign of Henry VI went into regency. Being groomed for the role, Henry was more a follower than a leader, allowing favourites to influence him. Henry's marriage was very political, marrying Margaret of Anjou in 1445. 8 years later they had a son, Edward, who was known as Edward of Westminster due to the palace where he was born. Prior to this, Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester and younger brother of Henry V, was acting regent. He married Jacqueline of Holland, but after 6 years, with only one stillborn child, the marriage was annulled, and Humphrey married his mistress, Eleanor Cobham. On the death of his brother John of Lancaster in 1435, Humphrey became heir apparent, and it was 6 years later, in 1441, that 3 priests and a witch were charged in a plot to kill Henry VI. Humphrey's wife was also implicated, but Eleanor would only admit to 5 of the 28 charges laid against her. She was made to do penance through the streets of London with lighted candle, forced to divorce Humphrey, and then imprisoned at Peel Castle on the Isle of Man, locked in the crypt where she remained until her death 14 years later. Humphrey had enemies, especially Henry Beaufort, who was instrumental in bringing the charges, and so we have to wonder if an ambitious woman, in an attempt to become queen, got her just deserts, or was she just a pawn in the political arena? We will probably never know. Humphrey's influence and power waned, and a few years later he was arrested on trumped-up charges of treason, but died before coming to trial. Whether this was by foul means or not, it very conveniently got rid of an embarrassing problem and a certain contender for the crown. Henry VI suffered bouts of depression, if not madness, and with the country thrown into civil war, with the Yorkists claiming the crown had been usurped by Henry IV, Richard, the third Duke of York, and the great-great-grandson of Lionel of Antwerp, laid his claim. When Richard died at the Battle of Wakefield, the fight was left with his son Edward. Henry went into exile as things swayed the Yorkists' way, and was later captured, with Edward of York declaring himself king. But Henry's queen was made of sterner stuff, and rallying an army with Edward's brother, George, the Duke of Clarence, as an ally, she was set on regaining her husband's crown and her son's inheritance. Edward was forced to flee, and Henry VI was set up as king once again, but this wasn't to last long, and a year later Edward returned. This time the victory was complete when Edward of Westminster was slain at Tewkesbury. In fact, he is the only Prince of Wales to be killed in battle. This time Edward wasn't taking any chances, and Henry VI died while imprisoned in the Wakefield Tower at the Tower of London. His ghost is said to be seen on the anniversary of his death, with reports varying from 11 p.m. to midnight. Unfortunately, either way, it's when closed to the public. While Henry lay in state at St Paul's Cathedral, the belief that the corpse of a murder victim would bleed in the presence of the murderer seemed to ring true, as witnesses claimed to see blood coming from the king's body. Though there was no proof that Henry had been murdered, his death was too convenient. There were stories of miracles associated with only the rightful monarchs, and his grave at Chertsey in Surrey became a place of pilgrimage. The church condoned in burning candles and forming a shrine with statues and paintings of the king. The dagger that was said to have been used was kept in the chapel at Cavenham in Suffolk. That was until the dissolution, when it was taken for Henry VIII's coffers. Henry was reinterred at Windsor in 1474, and yet again there was claims of miracles and those mysteriously healed. It was the people indignant at the way of his passing that made Henry a saint. And as for Henry's queen, Margaret was captured and imprisoned at the Tower of London until her nephew, Louis XI of France, paid for her release, but only in exchange for her inheritance, the lands of Anjou. Margaret returned to her homeland, where she died in 1482. During the strains of battle, Margaret spent some time with friends at Alpen Manor prior to the Battle of Tewkesbury, the Queen's chamber being named after her. It is said that this was the last place where she was truly happy, as expectation of victory must have been high. This is why her ghost is said to linger at the manor. And so, with Edward IV coming to the throne, it meant an end to the Lancastrian succession, bringing about the House of York.